I've had a special request to talk about how you can take stock art like this, and this is royalty free, and turn it into something like this. So this is a little, just kind of like a little quote tile, and it combines both engraving and cutouts. So we're going to walk through how to turn royalty-free artwork into something that you can cut and engrave with the Glowforge that has just kind of like a nice feel, and you can see this is sort of a gift box example of how you might use this item. So the first thing I want to note is that this royalty-free art is from FreePick. I believe the ones I'm working with are from Font Bundles or Font Bundle, but they're easy to find. The one thing you will want to do is, if you're going to use this work, you usually need to pay for a subscription in order to not attribute the original artist. And you'll want to read through any caveats with the licensing, so make sure that you're reading that ahead of time. For the purpose of this, I'm not actually going to make or sell any of this content. I just want to show you how to work with these types of files. So initially you would download them, and they're likely to come, in this case for FreePick, they're usually going to be like a PDF or an EPS, which is going to open perfectly in Illustrator. And you'll get something like this. You can see it's just a grouped piece of vector art, and if I like double click to click into it, I can see that I can kind of jump into the group and kind of mess with what's here. And then what I want to do is I actually want to take this, I want to convert it to a file where I'm going to be able to really easily upload and cut multiple of these from one proof grade sheet, as well as some little feet to stand up this little sign. So we're going to make some little feet for it as well. So the first thing that I actually want to do is I'm going to go to the Glowforge interface. And I have a little file here called test. And you can see this is my previous image of what was on the Glowforge bed, but we're going to ignore that. And instead, we're going to select the proof grade material we want to work with. So in this case, I'm going to hit medium cherry plywood because I think that's closest to what we're seeing here. That may actually be cherry plywood there. And with that, once I've done that, it's going to set the focus height. And then it's going to try and set this rectangle that I've created, which you can actually do with the insert shape function. In this case, I actually just uploaded a rectangle I'd made in Illustrator. And I'm going to size that rectangle until I find out what the maximum cut size is. So I've actually already done that. So you can see if I make this any bigger, it's not going to be able to cut because the gantry head for the Glowforge it can't cut that far over for this particular material, based on the speed and the power it needs to cut. So this may vary depending on the material. If it has to move really fast, sometimes you're going to have less of a working area because the gantry needs to slow down so it doesn't slam into the side of the machine. So in this case, what I did was I just resized the rectangle bit by bit until I had reached the maximum size that it would cut, and then I positioned it at the top left corner. If you click this reposition and resize selected artwork, you'll be able to see both your X and Y positioning, as well as your width and height. And taking that information, I went back to Adobe Illustrator and I created a new file, and it's already got some content in it, and it's called test. And then I created some different layers here, so you can see we're going to see exactly how to get to this stage, but I'm going to start from the beginning. And I actually created a guide that matches that rectangle size. And what that does is it shows me where on my artboard I can place artwork that will still cut. So if I make this any bigger, it's not going to be able to cut down here. So I want to stay within that guide. So let's take a look at what size our rectangle is very quickly. I'm going to unlock that layer and I'm going to look at it. So let's open this a little wider. I'm going to hit transform and I can see I'm at 19.4 by 10.95, and that will vary depending on the material. So 19.4, 10.95. I'm going to create a new document just so you can see how I would start this from scratch. And for the Glowforge, I always create a 20 by 12 document, and the reason is because if you create it this size, it's going to upload in the exact same spot every time. So that means that this working area that we're seeing in the Glowforge is 12 inches by 20 inches. And that means if I work positioning something in exactly a specific spot, whenever I upload, it will upload in the same area every time. Sounds a little weird, but just trust me, 20 by 12 artboard horizontal orientation. I'm going to create that. And then I'm going to name my layer, which is over here. I'm going to name this guide. I'm going to click my rectangle tool. I'm going to set the color to something obvious, and I'm going to turn the fill off. You can also do that here. And all I'm going to do is click once, and it's going to bring up my rectangle tool. And in that rectangle tool, I'm going to put in those measurements. So I believe it was 19.4 by 10.95. I'm going to click OK. It's going to make a rectangle of that exact size. I'm going to move it to the top left corner, and now we can see I have my divided up working space. Now that doesn't look right, so let me check my size again. Is that correct? Yep. Okay, so I was correct on that. I'll go back to my Untitled file, and I'm just going to lock that layer because I don't want to be moving that rectangle around. I just need that there for my own visuals. Now instead of creating that rectangle, what I could do is hit Command R to bring up my rulers, and that's on the Mac. It's Command R, I think it's Control R on the Windows machines. And I could drag out a guide to match that rectangle. And then instead, I could just delete that rectangle. And that might be the best way to go. So to create the rectangle first and just have your guide perfectly positioned and just snap it to that guide. And you can actually select your guides and tell them where to be, but we're not going to worry about that. So now I have my guides. I'm still going to lock that layer. And now it's time to create sort of our boxes for the rectangles, or for the squares, I should say, because we want to fit 6 around 5.5-inch squares. Now the way I would do it is you could just start by creating, let's click once again and hit 5.5 by 5.5 and kind of just sort of guess and kind of figure that out. Repeat those rectangles. So I'm going to hit Alt and drag. And you can see it's a little too big. So I'm actually going to grab both of them, holding Shift, and just resize them down and then resize them back up so they snap to the grid. You'll notice when I tried to resize down, it jumped over the guide. I just had to make it smaller so it snapped to the guide. It's kind of a silly item there. And then I can actually repeat these by hitting Alt and dragging them. And there I have my 6 rectangles. Now that looks perfect, but there's an issue here. Because we have multiple rectangles where the lines are overlapping, if I were to cut this directly in the Glowforge, it's going to cut over these lines more than once, and we don't want that to happen. So I'm actually going to highlight all of these, and I'm going to go find my Pathfinder panel, and that's right here. If you don't see your Pathfinder panel, go to Window and Pathfinder, and that will bring it up. And with these 6 rectangles selected, or squares I should say, I'm going to hover over and I actually want to hit Outline. And now when I do that, you'll see, oh no, all my rectangles went away. They actually didn't, they just became invisible because they lost their stroke and their fill. So if I re-highlight and reapply that stroke, you'll see that I actually have the rectangles back, but anywhere that there was an overlapping line, and they're grouped right now, so I'm going to ungroup it. There was an overlapping line, it will delete the overlapping line and instead just make a single pass. So what that's going to do is now the Glowforge will only run over these cut lines one time. The other option is to actually just use guides and draw a line with the line tool. So I did do that on this other one. So you draw one single line, another line, you know, these two, and then I actually would delete these top ones because we don't need to cut these outer edges. We may, but in general we might not need to cut them because the proofread material is already going to have an edge here, and then we're just cutting like this. It's sort of up to you. I might leave these lines and then just scoot it down a little bit so it's kind of cutting a perfect edge and you don't have to worry about whether your edge is exactly straight or whatever, but that's kind of up to you. You might need to experiment with that. But essentially now we have our cut lines. So I'm going to go back to my layers. I'm going to call these cut lines, and I'm going to lock that layer so that I don't accidentally move them around at the next stage. So I'm going to create another layer, and now it's time to grab one of these artworks. So I'm going to grab this one here. Make sure I have it all. You can see I don't, so I'll highlight over top, copy, go back to my document, hit paste, and then I'm going to position it in sort of the first quadrant here. Now, I know she wanted a score line around the entire thing, so I'm just going to hover till I kind of find the center. You can see it says intersect there. And I'm going to draw a reasonably shaped rectangle, and I'm going to get it centered in my box. And I'm going to change the color because I want to make sure every step is a different color so it's easy to work with in the Glowforge interface. I'm going to turn that green. Actually, I want to put those on their own layer as well. So I'm going to go back to my layers. I'm going to hit new layer, and I'm going to call this score. And I just double clicked to bring that up. You can also just double click here, and I'm going to call that art. Now, how to get this item onto this next layer, it's actually really easy. All you do is select it, and you'll see a little marker pops up here. If I click that marker and I drag it to the new layer, it will move that artwork over. Then I can lock my score layer, so once again, I won't be selecting it. Put the art on top, just because. And now I can work with the art here. So I am going to scale it down. Let me make sure I grabbed everything. And this is why you want to lock your layers, because I can just drag and highlight everything without accidentally grabbing these. I'm going to hold Command, Shift, Option to scale evenly to center. Scale however you feel comfortable. And I'm going to scoot it around until I like its position. I think that scale looks pretty good. And now I'm actually going to ungroup everything. So I want to make sure things are ungrouped. Looks like with a clipping mask here, I'm actually going to release that. I'm going to see, it seems like there's a couple little odd rectangles here, so let me just check and make sure. Alright, so we got quite a few little groups here. There's a lot of like little random groups. And there might even be some invisible rectangles. So you can see that's kind of like a weird artifact that was in the file. I'm going to delete that. And I don't really have a trick for finding those. I might mostly just like hover around until I see anything weird. And then I'll kind of check to see if there's anything wrong with it and delete it. There's not like a really magic potion for that. So instead I'm going to zoom in, and now everything's ungrouped so I can individually select all of the different pieces of art. You don't actually have to ungroup. If you see this stuff is still in a group here, in order to access an individual item in the group, in Illustrator all you have to do is just keep double clicking until you get to it. It takes you into something called isolation mode. So if I double click this, you can see I am now in this clip group. And if I click again, I'm in another clip group. And if I click again, I'm finally at this particular path. And so now I can individually select that item within the group. It's kind of awkward, but it's just sort of how Illustrator is. So if you want, ungroup everything and just keep ungrouping until it's all ungrouped, or just keep clicking until you get where you're trying to go. So if you just keep double clicking, eventually you will get to the object that you're trying to select. And now my next step is to actually decide what items we want to engrave and what items we want to cut out. So the first thing you want to be thinking about is if you select something for cut, are you going to lose an important piece? So for example, it might be nice to cut out the word life, but we can't, because if we do, then these little counter shapes are also going to fall out and you're just going to have this big open space and it's going to be hard to read. So for this artwork file, I think one of the best things to cut is going to be these little curlicues. So I'm just going to grab the whole group actually, and I'm going to try and change their color. But you'll notice there's a little issue here, and this is probably because they're grouped with some invisible object or something. You'll notice that it doesn't know what color they are, and that means that there's multiple colors in here, and that can be a problem for the Glowforge. So I'm going to release the clipping mask. I'm going to try and grab the clipping mask, which you can see is just a blank rectangle that had grouped everything. I'm going to delete it. And it looks like there's a lot of clipping masks here. Oh no. Okay, so sometimes a file's not ideal. Usually it won't come with this many like errors, but we had some issues transferring it over. So now you can see everything is nicely ungrouped and easy to select. I'm going to start selecting these by holding Shift and clicking each one. And now you can see it notices they're black, and that's a good sign. It means we don't have any weird invisible objects or miscolored objects in there. I'm going to go to my swatches panel. I'm going to turn off the fill. I'm going to select the stroke, and I'm going to pick a color. So now I know, because these are set to stroke, that these are items that I want to cut out of the artwork. Same here. I'm going to grab these two little decorative items, turn off the fill, select the stroke, and grab that same pink color. Now everything that's pink I'm going to want to cut. I could turn it blue so it doesn't match this pink. I probably should do that. And anything that's black is going to engrave at the moment. Now let's say I did want to change these to blue. Now I could individually select them again, but another little trick is to come up to your magic wand, double click it, and check both fill color and stroke color and set them to 1. Now when I use the magic wand, if I click this pink, it's going to find every object that has that exact stroke and that exact fill color. And that's another way to kind of break things out of clipping mess sometimes, is just to select them by color, copy them, paste them, and then delete the other object, because it won't select any of the clear or invisible objects if you do that. So I'm going to reselect that, and I'll turn those blue. Perfect. So if you want to do anything kind of a little different here, we could also decide, instead of engraving this area, we engrave it and then also cut out this little center part. Now this is another situation in which you're going to have to double click to get to that shape. So if I keep clicking, you can see I finally got to that shape, but it's actually part of the clipping mask. So that can be a little bit of a problem. If you did want to select that U, this little individual shape, you can see I was able to grab it here. But when I try and change its color, it kind of acts up. This sometimes happens when you have compound objects. So if you're struggling with that, you might just want to skip it. But one thing I can do is I can highlight this, go to my Pathfinder, and hit the divide function. And what that'll generally do is break apart anything that's connected. So you can see now if I remove it, it's an individual sort of like object. I can also copy it, delete it, hit Shift-Command-V, and that will paste that object in place as its own item. So now, I'm just going to drag that over, click that. Now I have a cut here. So it's going to engrave that and then cut out this sort of intersection. Now I don't actually want to do that, because if I do that, remember, it's going to cut out this whole center part of the O, and it's going to cause a problem. So I'm actually just going to go back and hit Command-Z to undo that. But I did want to show you that sometimes you have to go into a compound object to adjust something. That's kind of an advanced skill. It can be really frustrating to work with, but just know it's possible so that you can do the research to learn more about compound paths and how to manipulate those. So I think for the purpose of this is actually fine. I don't want to do too many cutout objects. I think it'll balance nicely. The text will be really legible. We could cut these out, and we may want to try that out. But for now, I think this will be fine. So once you have this all nice and orderly, you have your cuts, you have your engraves, we've got our score line, we have our outer pieces, the only thing left for this artwork is to copy this into each of our quadrants. So one way that I can do that is I'm going to come to my layers and I'm going to unlock the score and the art. And I can just copy, paste, and try to position it. And generally that's going to work just fine. I should be able to kind of space it even. You can see Illustrator's trying to guide me a little bit. Then I'm going to highlight all of these, Option drag them down, and get them centered in that section as well. And you'll notice that all of the score items should stay on their own layer, but it doesn't look like that actually happened. I think because I hit copy and paste on those ones. So all I have to do is select them, drag them with their handle down to score, and now we can see everything is now on its correct layers, the cut lines and guides. I can probably delete this guide layer, it looks like. And we're good to go. So the final step here is actually to make our little feet. So we want to be able to make this something that stands up. And I'm going to show you a really simple way to make some feet. I'm going to come over into this extra space that I know I can cut in. I'm going to make an oval. I'm going to take my direct selection tool to select this anchor point. I'm going to delete it. I'm then going to grab these two anchor points and hit Command-J to join them. So we already have like our little foot here. And then my next step is to create a rectangle. And I need the rectangle to be the width of the material, and I know that cherry plywood is 0.125 inches wide, and then the height can be whatever, it doesn't really matter. So this makes our little slot. I'm going to position it a little farther forward so that I can angle it back just a little bit. And that way the sign will angle back and the longer back end will kind of support that weight. I'm going to scoot that down just a little bit till I like it. Highlight both objects and hit minus front. And now I have a nice little foot. And all I have to do is option drag that. I'm going to loop that around like that, and that would be fine right there. So now I have feet, and all I have to do is copy and paste them until I have 6. Now, if you remember from before where we did that outline function, we can actually do that here too. So I can scoot these so that that overlaps. Let's see if I can actually snap it on there. You'd think it wasn't even. Perfect. So we now have an overlapping line. You can highlight both, go to outline, and then select a color for the stroke. Looks like just grab a little mint green there. And now I can double check. Sometimes it may not work if they're not perfectly overlapped, and I think that's what happened here, because you can see if I zoom in, this looks a little thicker. So you have to make sure that they actually overlap. So if you have a problem with it, that's what happened. I'm going to try that again. Outlines. Grab a stroke color, just purple now, and you'll see now if I double click in this, there's only one line here. So that will save me a teeny bit of material, and the Glowforge won't have to make this line twice. Just not necessary, but it's a little extra step. So I'm going to drag these until I have 6 of them. So one more. And I'd probably try and fit those a little closer together, but that should work perfectly there. So I made this the exact width of the material, so 0.125 inches. If you needed a really tight fit, you might want to make it a little bit more narrow, but I don't think I'm going to need to do that. So that's going to be all we need to do to set up the artwork, and now we're going to go into the Glowforge and we're going to look at how to set all of our cuts, our scores, etc. So the last step is to hit File, Save As, select PDF, and save the file. Just click Save and you're good to go. Okay, so now we're going to go into the Glowforge interface, upload that, and I'll show you how to set all of your functions for this file. So one thing to note just before we go over to there is just make sure that every step that you want to be a unique step is a different color. So our outer cuts, our feet, our score, and our inner cuts are all a unique color. Now I could set this pink for anything that's being cut, so that includes the feet, this, and whatever, and it would all happen in one step, but I actually prefer for it to be a little bit separate. It really doesn't change the time, it just allows you to change the order that things happen, which I think is helpful. So I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to go back to Glowforge in this test file. I'm going to delete this rectangle because I don't need it, and I'm going to import artwork. I'm going to hit Upload, and I'm going to go find that sample PDF. And I prefer PDFs over SVGs because sometimes SVGs will randomly change their size, and I've never had that problem with a PDF. So it's just a personal preference. So let's zoom this in, and you can see, bam, it shows up exactly in the top left corner, and it's pretty much good to go. But we have one little issue here, and it looks like these lines are a little too close to the edge and they're not wanting to cut. We should be able to scoot over 1 or 2 keystrokes, and we'll be able to fix that. And if that doesn't work, it's easy to go back to our artwork and solve that problem. So it may be that the combination of artwork isn't quite right. Let's double check here. So it looks like we're going to have to size everything down very slightly. And so let's check that here. So I forget, so one thing that always throws me off is if I'm used to holding Shift in Illustrator when I scale, but in the Glowforge, if you do that, it will actually break your proportions, and it's not something you want to do, so I'm going to undo that. Let's look here, and let's check our orders. All right, cool. So let's go back and let's resize that just slightly if that's not going to work. So one thing we could do is, if you remember from before, with my cut lines, I could just eliminate these outer cut lines because I don't really need them. So I'm going to delete that one. Let's see if that solves our problem here. Let's turn it off. Let's go find our guide. So if your guide's in the way, so you can see I can't tell if there's a pink line behind this, I'm going to go back to View, and I'm going to hit Guides, and I'm going to unlock my guides. And that will actually allow me to move them, and I can actually move them to their own layer as well. So I'm going to do that, then turn off that layer. So you can see that that section was connected. I've now lost that cut line. So instead of making a new one, I'm just going to drag this one over like that. And I can do the same here. So I could actually kind of clean up a few things if I wanted to. Let's make sure that we delete the lines we don't need. Looks like I need another line, so I'm going to drag this one over. And let's see if that'll work. And if that does not work, our next option is just to very, very slightly scale everything down so that they'll fit. So that's the other option there, is to scale down. But let's try this and see if that works. And if it doesn't, we'll come back, undo what we did. So I'm going to save it again. And we'll try a different method here. So let's go back to the Glowforge interface. I'm going to highlight and delete everything. Make sure there's no artwork left. And I'm going to re-upload. So this is kind of the troubleshooting process for making sure that these are going to cut correctly. So when I open, going to process here. Usually takes a few seconds. And then we'll see. So if you find you get really stuck in this section, sometimes it's that you have just too much artwork, like it's too complex, and it's not going to work. So we can see I'm still having issues with the cut lines not wanting to cut. So even though we use that rectangle guide, it looks like we are going to have to very slightly scale down our artwork. And I'm going to do it in the Glowforge interface for now, just to see what size I need to go down to. So I can see that I need a height of, let's try 10.83. Scoot it down and scoot it over. Let's keep checking. One way to kind of solve this would be, let's scale all the way down until we see that it's definitely working for all of it. Oops, held shift again. Perfect. And now, I can also see I have a little hidden cut line here, which I'll need to deal with. And now let's scale it up until we reach our max size. So that's looking pretty close. Let's try scaling it a little bit more. We're just going to keep testing, and that's too much. Let's go back down. Alright, that looks to be about our max size. So I'm going to re-highlight that whole section of artwork, and I'm going to look at the height, and it's 10.777. So I'm going to come back to Illustrator and correct that. I'm going to undo, and I'm going to go back to before I deleted all these outer edges. So I'm hitting Command Z until I'm back to where I was. It looks like they're all there. I'm going to move my guides again because I don't want to forget about that. Hit undo. And now, using the information I gained from the Glowforge, I can just highlight everything. You can see it's selected on multiple layers. Hit transform. Make sure my constrain width and height are checked. And I can scale this to 10.77. And then I'm going to scoot it over a little bit just to make sure it's going to cut. I'm going to guess that probably will work. I'm going to save it again, and I'm going to re-upload. So this is kind of tedious just because it's not always consistent what areas will cut depending on the material you're working with. But you may have to go back and forth a little bit to get this perfect. But once I have the exact size perfect, it's going to be really easy to make different designs using the same template. And there we go. And you'll notice I don't have to change anything. It's all going to cut perfect. So I am good to go now. So now I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to check all my settings and I'm going to put them in the order that I want them to be. So the first thing I actually want to do is I'm actually going to do my score first, and you can see it is set to cut. That's our green lines there. You can see when I highlight over them, they pop up in blue or teal. I want those to score. And I'm just going to do, let's do a high quality score. We want these to be nice. My next step is I always want to engrave next. And the reason is if you cut first and the little pieces fall out, maybe your material wasn't perfectly flat, there's always a possibility something will shift or not be right. So you don't want to cut out your rectangles before you've engraved your design in case they shift or drop out of the material. So I'm going to engrave next. I'm then going to cut the small items, cut the, let's actually cut the rectangles next, and then we'll cut the feet. So you can just drag and reorder as needed. And same thing, you can usually move stuff around, but one little thing I want to note is that the Glowforge interface tends to group items that are inside other items. So if I grab this and move, you'll notice I cannot individually select any of these objects. Because they're inside of a rectangle, it's going to group them automatically and I'm not going to be able to adjust them. And that's why you need to do that in your Illustrator program. So now that I have that set, you can see all I have to do is, if my machine was online, hit print, and it would go right through all of these functions and we would have a nice little sign at the end. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to start with royalty-free artwork and then adjust it into something that is a little more unique, so you're able to kind of create this sort of like cut and engrave style. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.